Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magness, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning and welcome to In the Word this morning. Today is a red letter day for us because we're concluding this quarter's work on gifts and gatherings, and we're going to end it with a joyous occasion in Jewish life, the Festival of Sukkot, or Sukkah as they say, which means tabernacles. And so we're going to have to do a little summarizing of what we've gone through for the past quarter, and then we'll see how tabernacles is a suitable conclusion, tying things together. We welcome you, and Dr. Magness and I are ready to talk about this.
Well, we've been talking about four of the great festivals.
Yes.
And this is the fourth of them. We had Passover, and we had the Festival of Weeks, which we as Christians call Pentecost.
Yes.
And then last Sunday, the wonderful Day of Atonement.
Yes.
And then now the Festival of Tabernacles, which took place just shortly after the Day of Atonement.
Well, the high holy days start with New Year's Day in the fall, and then there are 10 days of penitence, culminating in the Day of Atonement, which is a day of great sorrow and confession. And then there are some off days, and then on the 14th day of the month begins Tabernacles, and it goes for 8 days.
And we're talking about September, early October.
September, October.
Right, which is when their year started. And chapter 23 of Leviticus is where our
we
text
get the whole
comes.
story.
Yes. And it's a great chapter because it talks about many of their festivals.
Yes.
First of all, it talks about the Sabbath day. It talks about Passover and unleavened bread, which was a 1 day followed by a 7 day.
And then the first fruits.
First fruits, or Pentecost.
Counting the
weeks.
Omer.
Yes.
And counting the Omer,
the 50th day.
The 50th day gets us to the Festival of Weeks, or harvest, wheat harvest.
Chapter 23 next briefly mentions the New Year's festival where they blew their trumpets.
Yeah, but I don't think they called it New Year's.
They didn't call it that, but it's the trumpets. Yeah. And then we came to the Day of Atonement, which we talked about last week, and then finally Leviticus 23 ends with a discussion of this Festival of Tabernacles. Now, sometimes this is called tabernacles and sometimes it's called booths. Let's make sure we understand what those two terms refer to.
Right. Now, in our minds, we go back to the 1920s and the 30s, when great preachers were building these super big auditoriums for large crowds, and they called them tabernacles. I remember there was a tabernacle in my hometown, and it was big. That's not what tabernacles here means.
It's more of a temporary shelter, perhaps a tent would be one possibility.
Well, the way in which they do it now, you will find a sukkah, a thing that we're describing, on a fire escape in New York City or Chicago.
So you can put them anywhere.
You can put them anywhere on the ground or on a fire escape. Great. And they are temporary structures that are covered with all kinds of fall fruits and corn shocks and tree limbs and so forth. And you're supposed to sleep in there for 7 days, 7 nights.
Right. So some kind of a hut or a shelter, or a tent-like thing made out in the open.
Right.
Could be in your backyard or, like you say, on the fire escape.
This word sukkah, in plural sukkot, is exactly what the term that was used for the dwellings of the Israelites while they lived in the desert.
Which were more likely to be tent-like structures.
Tent-like structures, yes.
Good.
But now, the thing about it, though, is that there's a whole tractate devoted to this one, like there is for Passover and the Day of Atonement. And they had all sorts of rules about how much vacant space. So this is not a solid tent that you build. It is sort of a shack with holes in the walls and the roof.
Okay.
So
good.
And that's the way in which it's celebrated nowadays.
Yeah. Now, each of the three great festivals, Passover, unleavened bread, weeks, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, had an agricultural background or a connection to it. Yeah, a connection.
Well, I would say the historical memorial probably, or feature, probably is the older one.
All right, let's talk about that then. Passover commemorated their exodus from Egypt.
Yeah, the opening of the sea, and their escape from the armies of Egypt.
The eating of unleavened bread, and their hurried escape.
Haste, yes.
Yeah. And then this one we're talking about today, Tabernacles, is connected, as you suggested, to their journey through the wilderness.
Yes, and God's care for them. It makes the point that we would not have survived had it not been for the mercy of God in the wilderness.
So this is a festival of celebration, celebrating God's provision for them while they were in the wilderness.
Correct. And
bringing them to the promised land where they could then grow their own crops.
Now the question is, what about Pentecost or weeks? It is traditionally a memorial to the giving of the law by God to Moses for the Israelites.
Okay, so you have Exodus connected to Passover, Sinai, giving of the law, connected to Pentecost.
Yes.
And then journey through the wilderness connected to Tabernacles.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Now, they did also take on the flavor of an agricultural Thanksgiving festival.
Because of the timing of them. Because in the spring, you have the budding and rebirth of nature and that kind of thing. And you have the winter cereal harvest, starting with barley, and then 7 weeks later, wheat.
Yeah, so Passover was connected to the barley harvest.
Yes.
And weeks, or Pentecost, was connected to the wheat harvest in the early summer.
Correct.
And then Tabernacles is connected to what we usually think of as harvest time in the fall.
And it was harvest time for grapes and fruits and vegetables of all kinds for them too.
Yeah.
But not cereals. The cereal harvests were spring harvest.
Well, good.
And that's because of the rain cycle. That it rained in late fall and winter, and that gave the cereal grains their opportunity to grow. And summer there was very, very dry. It was good for grapes and olives and fruit trees,
but less so for wheat or
not
the grains.
Not for the grains.
All right. Well, why don't you read the Leviticus 23 description of the Festival of Tabernacles?
All right. Beginning at chapter 23, verse 33, the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the seventh month, the Lord's Festival of Tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day hold a sacred assembly and present a food offering to the Lord. It is the closing special assembly. Do no regular work. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing food offerings to the Lord, the burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices, drink offerings required for each day. These offerings are in addition to those for the Lord's Sabbaths, and in addition to your gifts and whatever you have vowed, and all the free will offerings you give to the Lord. So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you have gathered the crops of the land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a day of Sabbath rest, and the 8th day also is a day of Sabbath rest. On the first day, you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live in temporary shelters for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now, this terminology, temporary shelters, is actually the word Sukkot in the Hebrew language.
The concept of huts and shelters that we were talking about.
Yeah, right.
Well, let's look back through the text and see if there are a few things we want to comment on, and then we'll step back and take a big look at what are some of the general themes that are occurring in this festival.
Right.
First of all, in verse 34, we note that it took place on the 15th day of the 7th month. In other words, right in the middle of the month, which you were telling us is the full moon.
Well, month.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The month always began when the first crescent of the moon, the new moon, was seen in the west. Mm-hmm. And that became the first day of the new month, which means the 14th and 15th days of the month are always full moon.
So this would be a good time as their festival commemoration went on into the evening hours. They would have light.
Very much so.
They would have
and this is precisely 6 months, exactly 6 months after Passover.
Okay. Then verse 35 tells us that a couple of things. The fact that it's a sacred assembly means that this was a time when Israelites were expected to come from their homes and gather eventually at Jerusalem.
They're called forth. In fact, the terminology means this is an assembly of people who have been called forth to gather.
In some translations, it's called a holy convocation, which means a calling together. That's what that word means. Yeah. The other thing we learn from verse 35 is that it is a Sabbath, by which we mean it's a day of rest.
No work.
No work.
It's interesting that this translation says no regular work. I think they're trying to communicate, well, there were some things that they were commanded to do, like offering sacrifices. That was not defined as work.
Right.
So
they were not expected. They were expected not to pursue their normal activities and professions during that time. And then there's an 8th day tacked on, according to verse 36, which is another Sabbath. It's another day of rest and another day for gathering together for worship.
Yeah, no work again.
So on the likelihood that a Sabbath would occur during the week, a regular Saturday Sabbath,
would probably be usually.
Most of the time, this would be an 8-day period with 3 days of rest in it.
Correct.
So plenty of time.
An 8-day cycle.
In an 8-day period.
Yes.
Plenty of time to focus on worship and celebration.
And I think these verses that follow indicate that not only do you bring the special food offerings connected with the celebration of tabernacles, but and that's in addition to any food preparation that would be required for a normal Sabbath day.
Right.
So if you get 3 days of no work, you still also have to offer these sacrifices, not defined as work.
Right. I noticed that over in Numbers chapter 29, where this Tabernacles festival is discussed again, it's more specific about which animals they were to bring.
Yes.
And during this week, it looks to me like it could total as many as 200 animals that were to be brought in as sacrifices. So a continual round of offerings and sacrifices.
Let me make a comment on this, because we take for granted the presence of meat in almost every meal. That was not the case back then. The sacrifice of animals to go along with bread, vegetables, fruits, and so forth was not an every meal situation. So it was rare. Maybe rare is too strong a word, but it was not always the case that a meal would have meat in it. Now, for the wandering people, they would have meat more often than the people living in towns. So whenever you have meat brought into a meal, you know this is a special celebration. It's sort of like our Thanksgiving when we have all kinds of meats. If you don't have at least turkey and ham in my family, you haven't had Thanksgiving dinner.
True. And in my growing up family, my grandmother wouldn't have Thanksgiving dinner unless somebody brought her a rabbit that had been fresh shot that morning.
Is that right?
So we had turkey and ham and rabbit for our Thanksgiving festival.
But see, that made the Thanksgiving meal for us a very special occasion.
Sure.
And so it is here with Tabernacles, that you're going to have all this animal meat, which is a big celebration to do that.
Verse 38 is interesting. At the end of this parenthetical section of verse 37 and 8, it talks about gifts that you have pledged or promised, and then all the free will offerings you give to the Lord.
Right.
That's an interesting concept, isn't it, of the promised or expected gifts, and then the free will offerings that are on top of that.
That is true. And the term here for free will offering is precisely that. It's the term describes that which comes from your heart over and above whatever is required.
Yeah. That's a concept of Christian generosity that lives on, I think, in the church today, doesn't it?
Yes.
The idea of making regular gifts, but then always being ready to kind of overflow in generosity.
Well, there's a case of that in the life of Paul, where he goes from church to church and even writes in some of his letters about an extra gift that is being taken to help support the the destitute Christians in the Jerusalem church.
And it maybe helps us make sense of the concept tithes and offerings, which is a common phrase.
Yes, it is.
Well,
the tithes is not.
The term tithes does not appear here.
But the principle is the same. Yes.
Now, when we come to verse 39, we're back talking specifically about the Festival of Tabernacles, and we begin to learn a little more about what was involved conceptually in this festival.
Yes.
So first we have the word celebrate in verse 39. They are to celebrate this festival.
Yes.
And this really is a festival of thanksgiving, isn't it? And of joy.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But see, it's the other side of what has gone on for 10 days beforehand.
Leading up to the Day of Atonement.
Leading up to the Day of Atonement. And then there is a quiet few days in which there is no unusual celebration. And then you move into joy, thanksgiving, eating.
So the first 10 days of the month are for self-reflection, repentance, sorrow for sin,
prayer to God.
Prayer and the confession of sins.
Right.
All of that leading up to the Day of Atonement, which we talked about last week.
Then the mood shifts.
Now we get, after a little break, we get 8 days, a whole week, filled with celebration and thanksgiving.
Exactly.
And we see that verb right there in verse 39.
And the day after Tabernacles is Simchat Torah, which means the joy of the Torah. And that is a festival of having completed reading the 5 books of Moses. Now we're going to start over again.
Okay, now that's a festival that's not mentioned in the Old Testament,
no.
But it's in Jewish worship
practice
today.
And notice the word joy.
Yeah. Now verse 40 tells us how they expressed this and brings us to another important verb, and that is rejoice. So we had celebrate in verse 39,
yes.
Rejoice in verse 40, and here we get these branches that they used to celebrate.
And they made a little bouquet of several different tree limbs, and they put in an ethrog, which was a citron, in this little bundle. That was a symbol of the joy and the graciousness of God in providing food and shelter for them.
There's a little bit of reminiscence here of the triumphal entry of Jesus, isn't there?
Yes.
With the waving of palms.
Yeah,
branches.
That is almost like a part of Tabernacles has been seized upon and moved into the time of Passover. And for the triumphal entry.
Yeah, if this was a way of expressing their joy, this waving of branches, you can see how that might have spread to other practices throughout their year.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we have celebrate in verse 39, we have rejoice in verse 40.
Yes.
Verse 41, we're back to celebrate.
Yes.
And then that word celebrate.
That's actually one simple verb from which we get the term festival. And they have a verb for it. And so the only way to express it is to make this combination of words. Yes.
And then it's repeated again near the end of verse 41. Then verse 42 is the instruction that they are actually to build these shelters and camp out in them.
Going on a camping, but you don't go on a trip. You stay at home.
Yeah, you go out to your backyard.
You go out in the backyard or on the fire escape or the roof.
And build a shelter wherever you live, and you're supposed to spend the night out there.
Yes.
For all during the week.
And it's a time of joy and getting together with your family and swapping stories and being happy.
So kind of like going on a camping trip, but with all the comforts of home,
ready. Camping in the living room.
Right at home. And it says all the Israelites were to do this. And then verse 43 brings us back to that important historical event that is being commemorated.
And the memorialization.
Yeah. And so that all the descendants will know, and the verb there means remember, that the Israelites lived in tents as they were being guided through the wilderness.
Yes, and this completes the year, starts the new year.
Yeah.
Now, there are 2 passages in the New Testament we got to look at very quickly.
Yeah.
And what about John 7?
Well, John 7, Gospel of John, chapter 7, is interesting because the chapter begins in verse 2 by telling us that the Jewish festival of booths or tabernacles was near. And so Jesus' family was going to Jerusalem to participate in that festival.
Because you're supposed to do that.
You're supposed to do that.
It's assembly.
And they wanted Jesus to go with them. Jesus decides that he wants to go kind of under the radar and not make a big deal out of it, and have his brothers say to him, "Oh, come on, Jesus, do a miracle," or something like that. So throughout chapter 7, we get references to the festival. For instance, in verse 14, about the middle of the festival, Jesus went up to the temple and began teaching, and there was some conflict there with the leaders.
And people marvel at his teaching because they don't think that he has had the proper education. He's a Galilean after all.
And they're prejudiced against those hillbillies up in Galilee, aren't they?
Right, yes.
And then in verse 37, we get a reference to the last day of the festival, the great day. And
that means this is a Shabbaton,
that's
a
the
Sabbath.
Second Sabbath.
Yes.
That comes at the end, that eighth day.
And look at what he says.
Let anyone who is thirsty come to me. Let the one who believes in me drink. Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. He said this about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive.
Now, tabernacles, and we haven't said anything about it yet, but tabernacles is also a celebration of water because God supplied not only food, but water in the desert. And that's an important part of tabernacles,
and during the
water rituals.
And during the celebration of tabernacles in ancient times, the priests would carry water from the pool of Siloam up into the temple.
Correct.
As a ritual expression of God's provision of water.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, there's one other passage in the New Testament that seems to reflect tabernacles mentality.
I think it does. It's in Revelation chapter 7. And if we'll begin looking at verse 9 in Revelations chapter 7, here we see that there's a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, not just the native-born Israelites, I'll point out, but from every nation. And it says they're standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white with palm branches in their hands, which is exactly what they were to do at tabernacles.
Yes.
And they cry out, "Salvation belongs to our God." In other words, salvation or rescue, deliverance, is exactly what the Israelites experienced in the wilderness.
In the Old Testament, salvation is always a matter of living through a tragedy, a trauma, a danger. It's very concrete kind of a thing.
So these verses go on to celebrate the victory of God. And then in verse 14, the verse closes, "These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." There's a reference to water, which was a very common, prominent symbol. And then finally, verse 15, I find so fascinating. "For this reason they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple. The one who is seated on the throne will shelter them." And the word shelter is put a tent over them as a protection.
A sukkah.
Yes, which is exactly what they were doing.
In fact, there is this symbolism in Ezekiel and in a few other places of God building a great tent over the whole city of Jerusalem and everybody that lives in it.
Yeah.
And so the big sukkah, really big sukkah.
So this is a wonderful festival. It symbolizes remembering what God had provided for them, returning to God in worship, resting in the Lord, not doing their work, and most of all, rejoicing before the Lord.
Well, isn't it interesting that so many of these festivals and occasions in the Old Testament have their reflection in the early church as recorded in the New Testament, and from them to us in the 21st century. I hope this whole quarters work has been a help to you and that it has given you new perspectives on our Christian life today. Next week, we begin a new quarter, and we'll be in the New Testament in Mark and in the Gospel of Luke, and we hope that you'll be with us and join us in that study. God bless you during this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magness, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.